It's there.
So thank you, Rebecca Burgess, Senior Editor, American Purpose. And thank you all for joining today, this participant-intensive roundtable on a new report by Mike Mazza and Gary Schmitt on Taiwan and specific questions surrounding Taiwan. Tardiness is in the air, and so we have a very distinguished group with us already, but look to see another half dozen or dozen joining in the next, I expect, 5, 6, 7 minutes. But to you who are punctual, welcome and good to see you. So Gary Schmitt, I'll start with Gary, is Senior Fellow for Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at AEI, American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. He has Capitol Hill experience. He has White House experience. He's a prolific writer. He's an editor of countless books focused principally on national security, and he is also an American Purpose contributing editor. So, Gary, great to see you. Thanks. And welcome. And congratulations on the co-authored report. Mike Mazza is a non-resident fellow at AEI. If anything I say, gentlemen, is not up to date, you'll correct me. But also at AEI, also a prolific writer, also an accomplished and gifted manager and leader, among other things. He runs, oversees, leads AEI's executive program on national security policy and strategy. And these two gentlemen have co-authored a report that was issued in October. And if I have the title right, I'm looking at my bad notes, but I have read it, perused once and read carefully a second time. Righting a Wrong, Taiwan, the United Nations, and U.S. policy, October 25th, I think it is, 2021. We're going to have a conversation about the report. I commend it to you. Rebecca will put it in chat if she hasn't already done so. I commend it to you. It's not long, but it's substantive and it's detailed and granular. And it has a good chunk of history. It has a good chunk of law, international law, and it has a good chunk of politics and diplomacy. So it's rich and it's valuable. And it also advances a case. So I'm going to call on you first, Gary. And could you, for the benefit of those who haven't yet been able to read your report, before we get into the history and the politics and the legal aspects of this, what is the case that you and Mike are advancing in this report?
Well, I think the original reason for writing the report was very specific, which is for about almost 20 years, the UN Secretariat and thereby a lot of the other UN institutions have come to read the UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, which replaced the Republic of China on the Security Council and in the General Assembly with the People's Republic of China, Communist China. And they've come to read that resolution as meaning that for the US position that Taiwan's actually a part of the PRC. And Mike and I set out to show that reading of the resolution wasn't accurate. And then that led us into a larger argument about, well, what should be the status of Taiwan internationally? Also, what should be its status as a potential member of the UN? And we give a background for why Taiwan remains an established state under international law, and why, in fact, it's in US interest and the global interest that UN be made a participant in these UN organizations. And at the end of the day, we make a case for why Taiwan should be included in the UN as a member as well. Mike?
Before I go to Mike, Gary, a follow-up question. Um, you addressed this in the report, but I asked the question for the benefit of those who have not yet read the report. Has it not been the assumption in some circles here and abroad that the UN has had its own one China policy?
Well, yeah, they've come up with a one China policy. The UN Secretary Kofi Annan actually was the first to sort of put this down. It had to do with an incident in which a Taiwan diplomat was being asked by the UN Correspondence Club to give an address at the UN, give a talk, and Kofi Annan said that that was inappropriate because the resolution, his reading of the resolution was that, again, Taiwan was essentially a part of the PRC. That was sort of came out of the blue. And then his successor, Ban Ki-moon, actually made this much more concrete with a sort of a paper and a statement saying precisely that. And so since then, a lot of the UN organizations and other international organizations have taken that as the lead for denying Taiwan's participation in various organizations' activities, unless and until Beijing says it's okay.
So, Gary, thank you. Mike, if I may turn to you with the following, and I'm reading my scribbles, my notes, so I can't recall whether this is you explicitly or my paraphrase of you, but in the report is history. In the report is the case for Taiwan's inclusion, and in the report is ideas about advocacy. Could you all? I'm trying to touch a number of different points to get a number of different things on the table, so that in 15 minutes we can open it up to the gallery, and you all can take this whatever direction you wish. So bear with me, Mike. On the path forward, to see fulfilled what you and Gary advocate, if we just look at the United States, particularly the United States, where are the political obstacles? Talk to us a little bit about the Biden administration. Talk to us a little bit about the current configurations with the GOP, the sympathizers, the champions, and the opponents.
Yeah. So let me just step back a moment before I address that question. I think one of the sort of the key insights in the paper is that the United States and like-minded partners who believe that Taiwan should have more a fulsome engagement in the United Nations, that we should treat that as essentially as a negotiation with the PRC, but we have not done that to date, right? So essentially, we and others issue statements saying we support Taiwan's participation as an observer in the WHO, or pick your organization. China says no, and that's basically that, right? So what Gary and I argue is that we should aim much higher, set far loftier goals. Great if you achieve them, but if you don't, it actually gives China reason to meet you halfway, right? To find a compromise that works for everybody. And so the loftier goal that Gary and I propose is full membership for Taiwan in the United Nations, and we make the legal and political or policy cases for that membership. How hopeful are we that the Biden administration will pick that up? I mean, I can't speak for Gary, but I would say, personally, not particularly hopeful. This requires making Taiwan's inclusion a priority for the United States and its engagement in the UN, not over a period of weeks or months, but over a period of years, right? In a sense, we note in the paper, and I think this was Gary's insight originally, we need to take a note from the way the PRC handled this in the 50s and 60s and into the early 70s, right? This is a long-term campaign in which you are slowly winning for yourself allies and wearing away resistance to, in our particular case, to Taiwan's inclusion. So this is a multi-administration initiative, but it's certainly one that the administration in power would have to kick off. And I don't think we've seen anything suggesting that this administration, unlike its predecessors, is willing to do more than issue the periodic calls for Taiwan's inclusion. When you look to Capitol Hill, there is interest on both sides of the hill, both sides of the aisle, and both houses for deepening Taiwan's engagement. And there have been pieces of legislation which have gotten at this question over time. I believe it was the Taipei Act passed a couple of years ago, which calls on the administration to more deeply develop U.S. strategy for pursuing Taiwan's inclusion, but that hasn't led to any noticeable results, and it seems to me that there is just not an appetite for doing more. And I'll point out, Gary and I have done a number of calls with staffers on the Hill, without naming any names or offices. We did have a call with professional staff member on the Dem side who thought this idea was far too dangerous for Taiwan, that it would lead to far too much pushback. And essentially what we heard was that the course we're on isn't working, but nothing else or anything else will be too dangerous going forward.
So Jeff, can I jump in real quick?
Please.
One of our arguments when we're faced with that, that kind of counter argument is to point out, Mike mentioned it, but particularly during the 60s, leading up to the change in 1971, there was a gradual but surely momentum to recognize the fact that the PRC probably did deserve a seat at the UN. I mean, just population and its power, etc. So there was a kind of a international public opinion that was pushing in that direction. But I would argue, and I think Mike and I both think this, there's also been a reversal about China these days. It's quite remarkable over the last few years, public opinion, not just in the United States, but within democratic allies and other places, their opinion about China, where China is headed, has changed rather remarkably. So there is this kind of opening that could be taken advantage of, just as there was this opening that the PRC took advantage of in the 60s. The second thing I would say is that while we think this is a long-term campaign, it's in the U.S. interest to do some strategic messaging, particularly since even this administration thinks that that the crisis, perhaps, of the Taiwan Straits means that we have to take a much stronger hand vis-a-vis the coercion towards Taiwan by the mainland. So an argument about the UN participation or by Taiwan is kind of a strategic messaging that we care about Taiwan, and that we also are asking our allies to take Taiwan more seriously, because if all you're doing is ever saying, can you help us participate in this assembly or that assembly, you're really sending a message that you really are not so sure that Taiwan really is worth the effort that we're now trying to make on a tactical level. So talking about the UN membership really is kind of a way of strengthening not only your practical goals, but your strategic messaging as a whole.
So that may have eliminated my possibility to ask the next question, but just to deepen that part of the conversation, I will refer to my notes and ask it anyway. And Gary first and Mike second this round. To those here in Washington who might argue, will argue, we're in the midst of an intense strategic competition with China, and we need to pick fights. but not this one now, or that this one is desirable but strategically non-essential. How do you take up that conversation with those folks, Gary?
Well, it's a broader question. I mean, to be clear, this is a matter of judgment and prudence. I mean, so it's not simply black and white. There's all kinds of things that one has to think about what you're capable of doing at any given time, what the Chinese are capable of doing at any given time, and the like. But both Mike and I have written more times than I can count on my hands and my toes about the strategic importance of Taiwan. I mean, it's important as a trading partner. It's important as a technical base for all kinds of computer capacities that we depend upon in the U.S., chips and the like. It's an ally when it comes to dealing with proliferation, terrorism, and international crime. It has a remarkable health system that, the pandemic, we could have used their participation, much greater participation during this COVID period. And then finally, just strategically, the location of Taiwan. It sits between an ally, a strategic ally that we have a security treaty with Japan, and below, south of it, it's the Philippines, who we also have a treaty with, security treaty with, and it sits across some of perhaps the most important trading sea lanes in the world, or at least one of the two. And so if Taiwan were to fail or fall into the orbit of the mainland, it would be seen as a great strategic victory by the Chinese, and it would be an incredible detriment to our strategic position in the Asia Pacific region. So there's a lot that Taiwan brings to the table that we should care about. And then finally, I'll just say, by the way, we also have a law, the Taiwan Relations Act, which makes an obligation that we take those issues seriously.
So Gary, thank you. So Mike, I want to invite you to offer comment on the same question. Why this? Why now? Is this a strategic priority in context of the larger whole? And then the second question I want to add and ask you, Mike, the report and the argument advanced, how is it viewed in elite circles and by the government of Taiwan?
So look, on the first question, I would say two things. One is we set out to, with this report, set out to address the question very narrowly on, Taiwan's engagement in the UN. We don't assert in the report that it's the most important thing the United States should be doing vis-a-vis China or vis-a-vis Taiwan. And sort of, I'm not necessarily confident. I think it should be a sort of top 5 priority. That being said, I certainly agree with every point Gary made, and I think that as part of a broader effort to ensure that Taiwan maintains its de facto independence over time, deepening Taiwan's engagement in the international system and its ability to engage in international organizations is an important means of complicating China's calculus when it comes to how it engages across the Taiwan Strait. The more that other countries are engaging with Taiwan, as they would naturally do in the course of Taiwan's participation in the UN and the WHO and other organizations, the more that those countries will have some greater interest in Taiwan's fate. And I think that that's one important way, and not the most important, but one important way of enhancing deterrence vis-a-vis China. On your second point, I a couple things. One, honestly, we haven't gotten a whole lot of feedback from Taipei, which has been a bit surprising. I suspect that the current government in Taipei, that is welcoming of the sort of the legal and historical arguments that we make. But the Tsai Ing-wen government is rather risk averse. She's quite cautious. I think that has probably served her well and served Taiwan well. But what we offer up in this report is not a cautious approach. It's far more sort of forward leaning than anything that the United States has tried in decades. And it does require that the Taiwanese government embrace the American approach. So, honestly speaking, again, not having heard this directly, but just knowing the government that we're dealing with, I imagine that there would be some hesitancy on the part of Taipei at this point in time if the Biden administration sent this report over to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and said, hey, this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
Okay. Gary?
Can I just make the obvious point, which is that in so many cases, Taiwan really depends upon the leadership of the U.S. to make the first move. So they're very conscious of the fact that they can't get out on their front toes, and then have the United States not back something that they're interested in doing. So it may well be that among very senior people in the Taipei government, they welcome the report, but for prudential reasons, they're not going to be very public about that until they see that the administration is also interested in pursuing this.
So thank you both. So you all, in 5 minutes, we're going to open it up to questions, and you'll be able to put your question in chat or use the raised hand function, and I'll call on you. And while you're gathering your thoughts, a final question from me in this first half to Gary and Mike. So we've talked about the US, we've talked about Taiwan just now. Could you say a word about the allies? Japan comes to mind. Is there, we're generalizing, is there political energy for this idea? Are there people who have already done work in this area in places like Japan or Australia? And I do want to clarify to the audience and the colleagues in the gallery, if I misled anybody, Gary and Mike are indeed not arguing that this should be the United States strategy toward Taiwan, China, the region. It's but one element of a larger strategy, to be sure. If I misled, I wanted to make sure that was corrected. But to the question of allies, their status, approach, role going forward, they're also a piece of the puzzle. Mike?
Absolutely. Allies, like-minded partners are important here. I think we've seen in recent years, Japan, Australia, the EU and member countries, the UK, have been more vocal in calling for and supporting Taiwan's participation, as an observer in various UN organs. That's a good thing. We've seen, I think the Biden administration, to its credit, has put Taiwan on the agenda in its bilateral, bilateral relationships. So joint statements issued with Australia and Japan and South Korea, and there may be others I'm forgetting at the moment, have mentioned the importance of peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait. And that's new and different. It's not earth-shaking, but it's notable. And so I think certainly allies have a role to play here and are typically supportive of the idea that Taiwan should be included in. The argument that we make in the paper, first of all, I say certainly, we welcome allies, joining in this effort to pursue Taiwan's full membership. And part of what we call for is that we should be making the case to them for that. But we also recognize that, others are going to be hesitant to stick their necks out in the way that the United States might, and that there could actually be resulting pressure from allies on China to meet the United States and Taiwan halfway in order to avoid, a bigger fight within the UN system over full membership. And I think that would be a positive outcome, as far as we're concerned. Gary?
Yeah, a couple things. One's a old man story, which is about 20 years ago. I did a tour with some friends in Brussels and Paris and Berlin, London, to talk about Taiwan and Taiwan's relationship both to the international community, but also to Europe in particular. And boy, we just got nowhere. I mean, we were told basically, "Hi, glad to meet you. Now get out of my office." So that would not happen today. It's quite remarkable how many senior officials, both bureaucrats and politicians, have begun to take Taiwan more seriously. I think one of the advantages of our report is that, look, if it's much easier to argue for participation in things like the WHO or other organizations, in the case of Taiwan, if you lay out to people just how much Taiwan deserves international recognition. And so one of our tasks in the report is, if you think about Taiwan as somehow sort of an outlier case, you probably don't get as much momentum about making the argument about participation. Whereas if you lay out the case just how Taiwan fits under international law, its status as a legitimate international actor and state, and also you point out, how it's been a good participant in international affairs. I think it's much harder for allies to dismiss this issue of participation. In other words, if you don't make the bigger case, then the smaller case tends to just drift away.
So Gary and Mike, thank you very much. It's 12:30 Eastern on the dot. That's halfway through. We have a hard stop at 1 p.m. Eastern. Second half is open to the colleagues from the gallery. I'm going to first call on Shirley Hargis. Shirley, good to see you. Shirley is a China analyst with keen interest in Taiwan. She's also a Truman Fellow. She is also a close associate and contributor to American Purpose. Shirley, thanks for making time, and you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary and Michael, for coming. And thank you for your report. Your points, it seems that clearly that you all are thinking about more of a long-term strategy when it comes to helping the US and allies to be more willing to take a step out on behalf of Taiwan. Do you think that the Trump administration was the administration that was more willing, but was it to the advantage of Taiwan in the short and long term?
Yeah, I think that's the one area where they probably made the most progress in kind of a sensible way. I think they put the issue of Taiwan and China on the map in a more direct way. It was already coming. Remember Obama and the pivot. But the one thing I think that the Trump administration did was, put Taiwan into that context and started to make, serious arguments about why Taiwan mattered to us as a strategic matter, let alone a moral matter. So,
oh, sorry.
And I would just say that at least in terms of a lot of the rhetoric and other things, the Biden administration has been 90% following the path that the Trump NSC in particular laid down. Mike.
Yeah, that's okay. The only thing I'd add is I think the Trump administration, when it comes to Taiwan policy, sort of broke some glass in a good way, glass that needed to be broken. And the Biden administration has not tried to sort of put that back together. So, it's still early days, relatively speaking, but they've sort of picked up the baton.
Right. Okay, so if I can ask a follow-up question, comments like, I'm sure you both are familiar with Representative Nancy Mace's comments about calling Taiwan the Republic of Taiwan, and so of course the Republic of China. Do you think that comments like these, push the US further away from considering actions like the ones that you all outlined in your report? For example, you said what your experience with the representative who thought that this would only hurt Taiwan. Do you think that a lot of, Mace's comments and maybe some of the support that came from Taiwan under these comments that she made provides I would say, excuse? Does it give an excuse for the administration to not heavily consider what you all wrote out in the report?
So I think Nancy Mace's comments were probably well-intentioned, but just
Yes.
a bit silly. Taiwan hasn't chosen for itself the name Republic of Taiwan.
Right.
And so to suggest that using that phrase was sort of indicative of supporting Taiwanese self-determination,
Right.
it just doesn't sort of logically make sense. Again, I think she was well-intentioned. I think when it comes to, just broadly speaking, I think when it comes to Taiwan policy,
Mm-hmm.
There's always the risk of doing things to sort of poke China in the eye rather than doing things in order to improve U.S.-Taiwan relations, improve Taiwan's ability to continue to live free and independent. And those two things can be one and the same, but they need not be. And I think in particular now, it's very good that Taiwan is getting much more attention in the broader American body politic, but in Congress in particular. But it also raises the likelihood of some of that sort of eye poking rather than meaningful policy choices, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I would just add, I agree with everything Mike said. I would just add that her comments do have the perverse positive effect of actually people sort of going, well, wait a minute, what is Taiwan?
Right.
So that leads to the question of, well, is it a state? Why isn't it a state? They seem to be a self-governing democracy. So why does it have this outcast reputation? So again, it's not something I would have recommended if I was their staffer, but on the other hand, it was something that does lead people to sort of ask basic questions that are important.
Thank you both.
Thank you, Shirley. Is there anybody else? I'm going to continue, but is there anybody else right now that would like to jump in with a question or comment? And I'm going to continue, and feel free to raise your hand or put a question or comment in chat. Gary, you mentioned Europe and what a difference 20 years makes. What are some of those things that have moved European elites or EU officials to a, let's say, a more hawkish view of China or a more favorable view of Taiwan in recent years?
Well, there's just a whole host of things. There are people rightfully in Europe who are concerned about human rights, and so the treatment of the Uyghurs. Certainly in the UK and elsewhere, China's overturning of a treaty agreement on the status of Hong Kong has made a big difference. It's made a big difference in the region as well. The ignoring from the European perspective international law when it comes to the decision about the South China Sea that the International Court determined. And then on top of that, then because of all those things, paying more attention to Taiwan, and of course, monitoring all these military activities that are aimed at Taiwan over the past couple of years. I would also add that obviously the China's handling of the pandemic initially really costed a great deal of public negative public opinion in Europe and elsewhere. So there's a whole host of things that the Chinese seem to be doing. Plus, I must say that the Chinese diplomatic behavior has really been quite striking. Putting members of the EU Parliament, sanctioning them, members of the UK Parliament being sanctioned, treating Lithuania, a small state, so harshly just because it wanted to rename its de facto embassy from Taipei to Taiwan, representative office. So, China's doing everything possible to to fuel the fire, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Lithuania. I'm going to ask Mike, and both of you feel free to weigh in. But as much of the EU reorients itself on a number of these issues, sidebar, but interesting. Why Lithuania? Lithuania has been exceptionally forward-leaning on Taiwan. Mike and Gary, could you speak to that?
I have thoughts, but I think Gary knows Lithuania a bit better than I do, so I'll defer.
Well, my basic thought is Lithuania knows about being a neighbor of a big country that wants to occupy it, and so it's and it doesn't have the kind of commercial. China doesn't have the kind of commercial leverage over Lithuania that it has had over other European countries. So it's pretty basic. They see with their own eyes, they understand the situation that Taiwan faces.
So thank you, Mike. I want to go back to you. I think we'd be remiss in this conversation while focused on your report. We'd be remiss if we didn't ask the question, what is the likelihood that we will see some form of aggression from China toward Taiwan? I say some form because aggression has already been taking place in different forms. But if you step back from the report for a moment and you're counseling the Biden administration, and this is an exceptionally important issue, how do you rate right now the Chinese threat? Are we prepared? What kind of scenario should we be preparing for?
So, the way I think about it is I think that the threat to Taiwan is not yet imminent, but is growing more urgent. I mean, to put it just quickly, I think we're getting to the point where we find out what happens when an unstoppable force, in this case, the PRC, meets an immovable object, right? Taiwan. So public opinion polling in Taiwan now over 3 decades shows, shrinking and now minuscule support for unification, growing support for independence, either as soon as possible or eventually, overwhelming support for the status quo, which of course is de facto independence. Those same polls show consistently increasing trends of people in Taiwan identifying as Taiwanese and not identifying as Chinese or Chinese and Taiwanese. And of course, the leaders in Beijing know all that. And those trends, are continuing at a time when we have a leadership in Beijing and, now Xi Jinping, who has made unification with Taiwan, one of the planks of his promised great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation or the China dream. My argument is that he's going to find it difficult to deliver on perhaps the most important plank in that vision, which is greater prosperity for all. I think economic headwinds in China are significant. He's already delivering on some of the other promises regarding, national unity and social harmony. We see that with the moves against Hong Kong and Tibet and Xinjiang. And so when you run out of promises that you are able to deliver on, what's left, and what's left is Taiwan. And I fear we're getting to that point. I'm hesitant to put a sort of a year on it, but I don't think this is a 20 or 30-year problem anymore. I think it's a this decade problem.
Thank you. Gary, you want to address that?
Yeah, no, I'm in agreement with Mike about the idea that people can predict any of these sort of things, given the sort of how closed the Chinese leadership is, it's really hard to sort of get into their minds. But just on a sort of objective level, I think there's a relatively short period here where China is going to be looking at a situation in which they have increasing capability that they're really spending a lot of resources on. At the same time, the United States has made it clear that it intends to really quite significantly increase its capacity in the region. So there's a kind of a traditional opening here where China's got to make, and Xi in particular, has got to make a decision about if he waits too long to do something militarily, he may face a United States that's powerful enough that would deter him or make a victory impossible. So there might be a window here that we have to pay attention to, in which Xi himself looks at his growing capacity, even if it's not as perfect as he would want it to be, versus time down the road when the United States will be much more formidable in the region, along with its allies. So there's kind of a window here that I think that we have to really be serious about and pay attention to.
I would just, if I could add to that.
Please do.
So there are, still quite a number of China watchers who, reasonably argue that Xi Jinping is not in a rush when it comes to Taiwan, that his intentions haven't changed, that in some ways his language has been consistent with past leaders. But, I think a point Gary was getting at, besides this timing issue and the changing balance with the United States, is that, for essentially the entirety of the PRC's existence, launching an amphibious invasion and invading and occupying Taiwan was out of reach. We're now at a point where either that's feasible or will be feasible soon. Is still very difficult. And again, even if Xi Jinping's intentions haven't really changed, when you have new capabilities and you have new options available to you, that creates again, it creates the risk that wasn't really there before. And so, when the PLA goes from saying to him, no, we can't do that, to yes, we can, I think things get much more dangerous.
And I'll just, one more little footnote, rightfully so, we spend much of our time worrying about sort of an actual invasion of Taiwan or the island Formosa. But there are other scenarios, like, for example, the Chinese taking some of the smaller islands that Taiwan claims in the South China Sea.
Yeah.
That could be, much safer for China to do, and would put the United States and Taiwan in a difficult position because it's unlikely that we would be able to really defend them. And China, the last time it really did a major military campaign, of course, was against Vietnam way back in the 70s, late 70s. And the logic for that seemed not to be anything in particularly sort of capturing land or the like, but to send a message. And so, it was a long time ago, but the Chinese have used their military in the past to send messages as much as conquest. So that's always a possibility as well.
So thank you both. Shirley, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but allow me to ask one other question. It occurs to me we might address the administration's democracy summit next week. And Mike, you had mentioned at one point in passing Tibet and Hong Kong. Admittedly, there are a number of different lenses through which one can look at these multifaceted problems and challenges. But to you and Gary, do we need a strategy for the democracies on China's periphery?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I would say two things. One, I think is the United States has an interest in ensuring that those democracies survive, that they remained, sovereign and independent, that their democratic processes and institutions remain robust. We know that China is constantly trying to undermine democratic processes and faith in democratic institutions, especially in Taiwan. So I think there is a sort of a defensive piece, right? But secondly, I do think that the administration is right when it argues that, and the president in particular, that what we're seeing now is a competition between authoritarian and democratic systems. And if that is right, then I think the administration is right in trying to find common purpose with other democracies in order to respond to China's rise, and in particular the way that China is rising. Those shared values and shared systems provide a comparative advantage for the United States and its partners that China doesn't really have with others, except for Russia and North Korea, and the shared values with Vietnam don't actually bring those countries together. So the simple answer to your question is yes.
Mike, thank you. Gary?
Yeah, so I edited a book on the rise of China back more than a decade ago that had some really fine essays by Ashley Tellis and Robert Kagan and colleague Dan Blumenthal and others, Nick Eberstadt. And I've contributed an essay on this precise issue, which is start with the fact that Indo-Asia area, there's more people living under democratic rule than any other region of the world. It's always struck me that we actually haven't paid as much attention to deepening democracies and democratic rule, liberal rule in the region as we should have. We've kind of had, I must say, kind of a cultural bias that, there's only certain parts of the world that really are dependable when it comes to democratic rule. But I think time has shown that that's not necessarily the case. And I think the Biden administration would do itself a big favor if not only it spent a lot of its time, sort of building up capacity for on the security front among democratic states, but it also began to develop a roadmap for bringing the democracies in Asia together to begin to themselves agree about what good governance looks like. Because we've had some slippage, obviously. Well, we lost Burma, for example, but India is not headed in exactly the best ways. But there are countries like Indonesia where there's a lot to be done, and one would hate to sort of see it slip. So there's a lot of work to be done, and I think strategically, the deeper the democracy element in Asia, the stronger the strategic efforts we make will be more successful.
So thank you both. Shirley, we'll go back to you right now.
Thank you. My question is, do you both think the future DPP administration in Taiwan under President Tsai Ing-wen will model itself after her current hesitancy that you both mentioned?
It's really difficult to say. Depends on specific candidates and international context and domestic political context. I'd be hesitant to offer a guess.
Well, let me specify this way then. That makes sense. Let me specify this way. Do you think that the best thing that one of the best things, the key things that Taiwan can do is to continue to define itself away from the backdrop of US-China relations, such as their disinformation campaigns, how they manage well with that, beyond everybody knows about the semiconductors, the chips, et cetera. But is there a way for Taiwan to display to everyone how to, especially as we're going through cybersecurity challenges, many countries are, how Taiwan can display itself as a model for how to manage disinformation campaigns. So I know Estonia is, Taiwan, a lot of folks mentioned the both of those countries. But do you think that there's a way for Taiwan to showcase to everyone else that there might be a model for them to follow? Maybe not T to T, since they're different countries, different landscapes. But do you think that disinformation piece would be very valuable to other countries?
Yeah, and I think they've tried to do that. I think they have done it through the Global Cooperation Training Framework, which is a initiative that was started during the Biden administration, I think 2015, in which the United States and Taiwan together host workshops primarily with sort of track 2 dialogues, essentially, or track 1.5 with civil society leaders from across the world on a variety of topics. Japan has joined these as a formal partner, so is Sweden. And some of those have gotten at things like disinformation and media literacy. Gary and I did a paper on this a couple of years ago on the sort of China's attempts to interfere in the elections that Taiwan had in 2018, and one of the recommendations that came out of that was that the United States and Taiwan, hopefully together with others, should put together sort of a disinformation fusion center, share the sorts of tactics they're seeing, share what strategies are working, engage governments and private sector entities to counter these sorts of campaigns. Again, I think the interest is there. The challenge comes in the mechanics of countries being sort of willing to take Taiwan up on that offer.
Right. Thank you.
Shirley, thank you. We're approaching 1 p.m. Eastern, our hard stop. I'm looking to see if anybody else would like to get in, but so briefly. And as I look through the gallery, I'm going to ask Gary and Mike if there's any final point or comment you want to make, something that we didn't. It's a short hour and it's a full, rich report that we didn't get to dig into, or you want to refer people to in the report, Gary?
Yeah, just a obvious point that I think is on the minds of some people when we say, the U.S. should support Taiwan's role in the UN, and they, naturally enough go, well, the United States doesn't recognize the Republic of China diplomatically, so isn't this an issue? And just as a technical matter, or as a legal matter, it's not. North Korea and South Korea are both in the UN. They don't recognize each other's sovereignty over the peninsula. The same thing held for East Germany and West Germany when they both were accorded membership in the UN. East Germany never recognized West Germany and vice versa. And so this issue of whether you actually have recognition of a state doesn't necessarily preclude it from being a member of the UN. So just as a technical matter, I think those examples help bolster our case for why thinking about Taiwan more broadly than we have is useful. I know Mike's got a good point on this whole issue about how the disjunction between our non-recognition but also our if somebody was to take up our proposal to push forward for membership. So I'll turn that over to him.
Thanks, Gary. That's exactly the point I wanted to make. I think one of the things we actually didn't get at is why Gary and I think that sort of a full court press for full membership for Taiwan could be effective in bringing China along. And the way we see it is that the risk for Beijing in making the case for Taiwan's full inclusion in the United Nations is less that we bring about that full inclusion. and more that it essentially makes the case for diplomatic recognition, American diplomatic recognition of Taiwan, right? So as the US builds a legal rationale for Taiwan's participation and seeks to bring it about, as Gary says, it will introduce some cognitive dissonance into US policy. And you'll start to see, I think members of Congress in particular and outside observers start to say, this case that we're making for Taiwan's membership actually presents a pretty strong legal case for formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. And that will really get Beijing's attention. And so putting a stop to that trend, that drift, I think would be in Beijing's interest, and a way to do that would be not to agree to Taiwan's full membership, which of course, again, we would love to see, but something less that nonetheless satisfies our goals and Taiwan's own for a deeper engagement with the UN.
So then, 12:59 Eastern, I'm happy when we can keep you all on time. Thanks to my colleague, Rebecca Burgess, Senior Editor, American Purpose, for hosting us today. Thank all of you in the gallery, a lot of expertise and a lot of knowledge and precious time spent. And it was an hour well spent. I'm certain you agree. And Mike and Gary, thank you for the hour. Congratulations on the report. Righting Wrong, Taiwan, the United Nations, and US Policy. It's in chat. If you haven't looked, have a look and read it. But Mike and Gary and everybody, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon. Have a great evening.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank everybody for coming.
Thank you all.